Ladies and gentlemen, the long road back to having a UFC event is just days away. I'm joined by my friend James Dunn, who, if you've seen any of my talks about UFC in the past, he has been a regular guest. I'm happy to have him here today. Hey, James, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Keith. How are you?
Not too bad at all, thanks. Now, this is interesting because this weekend, fingers crossed, knock on wood, UFC 249 is going to take place. In the main event, it is a contention for the light heavyweight, the interim light heavyweight championship between Tony Ferguson and Justin Gaethje. Of course, Tony Ferguson was supposed to face Khabib Nurmagomedov, but of course, with everything going on with COVID-19. Um, uh, Khabib is in Russia with his family and is not able to leave. So Dana White, with the mentality of the show must go on, has booked this interim title fight on an incredibly stacked card. And James and I wanted to chat about it. James, can you finally believe we're actually going to get to see some fights this weekend?
You know what? It's definitely hard to believe, but it's definitely welcome. These weekends without any fights or any sports or any concerts or anything in general have definitely been tough. So I'm super excited that our sport's going to come back first. And, big hats off to Dana. He was, very loud and proud about being able to be the first sport to come back, and he's accomplished that. Well, I say that doing this, so hopefully there's no issues this week with the COVID and all the extra precautions that I have to take for the fight. But absolutely excited that it's finally here and looking forward to the weekend.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's interesting because during this process, we Dana White was adamant that the UFC was going to be back, and one of the things that we saw was, of course, ESPN and Disney, which are significant partners of the UFC, stepped in and said, "No, listen, you need to put the brakes on it." He was looking at going to an island and having fights taking place there, but what ended up happening was the Floridian government has declared the UFC an essential service, similar to how they've declared WWE an essential service. So this event is taking place in an arena with no fans, James.
Exactly. Yeah, down in Jacksonville, Florida, where I think most people will recognize where they opened the beaches first, which
Yeah.
made news everywhere and kind of made folks a little bit wary of going to Florida. But ultimately, they think they can get it done in a safe fashion. So let's see them try.
Yeah. Now, I want to speak for you. Speaking for myself, I don't necessarily know that the UFC is an essential service, but what I will say is I've missed watching sports. I've missed watching the fights. So they're having it. So I'm excited to watch it. So we're going to break down this phenomenal card. Now, this is a very long card. It's starting at 6:30 with early prelims, which are going to go until 8 o'clock, and then the prelims start in that goes from 8 o'clock until 10. That's important to mention because if people don't want to order the pay-per-view, they're getting several hours of free content. Is there
For sure.
anything that's standing out in those early prelim fights that you're looking forward to?
Oh yeah, there's a bunch. I think the biggest one, the most notoriety, I think, would be Cowboy versus Anthony Pettis, and this is actually a rematch. It was a quick match the first time, if I remember correctly. I think Pettis hit him with a body shot and put him down really quickly. So it was interesting for me to see one Cowboy to get back in so quickly after losing such what I would call a quick match to Conor McGregor in 40 seconds. And, Anthony Pettis, I believe, is coming off 2 losses as well. So both guys, I think Cowboys 3 losses, Pettis is 2. So they both really need a win. So at least one of them will get that. I think you'll see, Pettis make quick work at a Cowboy. Cowboy definitely has taken some damage in these last few years of his career. And I'd really like to see him, hang up the gloves. He's I think the most winningest fighter in the UFC. He's got nothing to shy away from. He's had an exceptional career, and I think when he's fighting the likes of Pettis and some of these other folks that he's going to come up against, it's going to be really tough.
hmm I agree, and as you know, I've had the opportunity of meeting Donald Cowboy Cerrone on
Mhm.
his last UFC visit here to Ottawa. I think he's a great ambassador for the UFC. The thing that concerns me with Cerrone is the fact that consistently we're hearing him say, "You know what? I just wasn't in the mood to fight." I was like, with his last fight with Conor McGregor, his verbiage was, "Donald showed up, but Cowboy wasn't there." And when if you're in a different line of work, perhaps that might be acceptable, but when you're in there with trained killers, it becomes a lot more concerning. He's got one son, he's got another child on the way. To your point, he holds so many different UFC records. He unfortunately will most likely go down as one of the great UFC fighters that never held a title. I would even compare him to say kind of like the Dan Marino of the USC. Of course, Dan Marino never winning a Super Bowl, but still held in high esteem. I agree
Right.
with you. I think, especially if he loses this fight, um, I think he has to have a serious look and say, why am I doing this? I know it's very entertaining in the fact that for years we said, okay, well, Cowboy fights so many times a year. He's even said upcoming now with the UFC looking at doing 3 fights over the course of the next week, this coming Saturday, the following Wednesday, and then the following Saturday. Him saying, "Oh, you know what? I'll just keep my RV out there, and I can fight, on the next card if you want to, Dana." And it's like, but those are very entertaining sound bites. But the reality is that if you're going into something where you're doing it, half-assed half the time because you can't get motivated, then maybe that's the time to stop. Like if you're getting up and going to a job that you're not enjoying, you got to sit
Yeah.
back and ask yourself, why are you doing it? So,
Oh, for sure.
but
Yeah, and I think with Cowboy too, a lot of the talk with him was, he doesn't show up for the big fights. But
yeah,
now he's not showed up so many times, and you can even that one in Ottawa that you mentioned, he was very, very vocal about he didn't want to be there
yeah,
right until he walked out and actually won the fight. And then the same thing with Conor McGregor. And I think you have to ask yourself, how many times can that happen before it's an actual trend or kind of the regular thing that we're seeing? And like I said, I don't think his trajectory is upward. I think it's downward. And for him and his career and his head and his kids and his wife, I think it's time to call it quits.
yeah, absolutely. But even if he wins the fight, which is very much a possibility, I don't
Mm-hmm.
see a path for him to a championship fight anytime soon. I just don't.
Agreed.
I can very much see him in the role of as a gatekeeper for a title fight, but I don't see a path for him for a title fight at 155 or 170. Um, Switching gears, jumping into the main card, we've got so many great fights there. We don't have to go through all of them, but I have to talk about the last three, and of course we're looking at two heavyweights going at it. We've got Rosenstrike going up against Francis Ngannou. My prediction: someone's getting concussed. These are two extremely large men who just do damage to their opponents. Ngannou, his opponents usually don't get out of the first round. Tell me, what are your thoughts on that fight?
If there was two gentlemen I would never want to step into the octagon with, it would be those two.
Yeah,
Ultimately, both gentlemen extremely talented, extremely powerful. Both coming to the center of that octagon to take each other out. So I do agree with you. I think we will see significant damage in that fight, and I do not think it will go past the second round. And I think Ngannou will probably have the strength and the size advantage just by a little bit. And I think you'll see him take the fight. And similar to how he took out Alistair Overeem in really impressive fashion that made us all kind of say, wow, I think we'll see that again on Saturday.
yeah. You're not going to see a lot of arm bars in this fight. You're not going to see a lot of submission attempts. These guys are just going to be throwing just straight power. Now, I agree. I like Ngannou in this fight. I think Ngannou, of course, has got to be in line for a title shot. But with everything that's going on in the heavyweight division with Stipe Miocic and Daniel Cormier, he has some time. So he took this
Mm-hmm.
fight. And if we look at Rosenstrike's last fight, he was actually losing that fight up until the very last second when he caught Overeem with a huge shot, which actually ended up splitting his lip. For those of you who aren't squeamish, go and check that out. But I agree. I'm taking Ngannou in this one. The co-main event is for the bantamweight championship. It is former Olympic medalist Henry Cejudo, who is the champion, who was actually the champion also of was it the not the featherweight division, but the
Bantamweight?
bantamweight. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bantamweight. No, he was holding bantamweight. And what was the other title he had? Because he had two titles. It was
He
the
was
same
25 and 35, right?
25 and 35.
So featherweight. Featherweight
Featherweight.
and
Thank you. So he was a double champion. They took one title away from him, but regardless, he still has the bantamweight title. He's getting ready to defend it against the former champion, Dominic Cruz. Now, interesting story there is Dominic Cruz hasn't fought in, I believe, 3 years or so. He
Might
is
be by the time they throw down.
Yeah, he's a phenomenal fighter who's just been absolutely plagued with injuries over his UFC career, and now he has the opportunity to reclaim his title against probably one of the most effective marketers in the UFC, because he's also one of the most cringe-worthy people in the UFC, Henry Cejudo. What are your thoughts on that fight?
Honestly, I think it's a great matchup, and there's a couple different stories that are coming out of that one. I think you alluded to the first one, which was Dominic Cruz coming off a large 3 to 4 year layoff. And, you know, Dominic Cruz's whole career has been essentially written by these terrible injuries that he's had. And, you know, it's hard to say where Dominic Cruz might be if he wouldn't have had these injuries. But I think most people we could have written off. But Dominic Cruz, he has a special mind. He has a special mindset, and I think an attitude. And, you know, you've heard him say before that he doesn't believe in ring rust. And
Yeah.
he's one of the only fighters I've ever heard say that. And we've seen him come back after big layoffs before and absolutely look really good and dominate. So I don't think you can ever count out Dominic Cruz. However, I think we're seeing him on the very tail end of his career, and I would love to see this fight in him in his prime versus Triple C in his prime. I think that would be amazing. So ultimately, the other piece of this, Triple C coming off some really, really great and aggressive wins. I think, you know, the win over TJ Dillashaw at bantamweight, where TJ was taking EPO, he simply just ran him over, and TJ was looking really good there as well, leading up to that. So that was impressive. And then to see him really step up against Marias, I think that first round, he was taking those kicks at what I would call a kicking range. And then when they went to the corner, you know, you heard Henry's coach say, look, you're fighting him at kicking range. If you get to boxing range, you win this fight.
Yeah.
To see him make that adjustment and not only, you know, flip the fight around, like it was a clear 10-9, might have been a 10-8 round, right, for Marias. And to see Triple C turn that around, change the strategy, and literally dominate him and put him out was absolutely unbelievable. And I think you're seeing a guy just hitting his stride, a special athlete, right, with the gold medal in wrestling and obviously the championship at bantamweight already, in featherweight, I should say, sorry. He's going to be here for a long time, and I don't think I would like Dominic Cruz to win because I actually like him quite a bit more, but I see Triple C taking this fight and just being too much for Dominic.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Dominic Cruz is one of, if not my favorite UFC fighter. I just to what you said earlier, I just absolutely love his fight IQ, and he's just such a tactician. I just really respect that, and he has such an unorthodox, bizarre style of fighting.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anybody who fights the way that he does. So yes, the time apart from his last fight is huge. But there's a couple of things about this fight that really intrigue me. The fact that they are on a very short list of people who have beaten Demetrius Johnson, who at one point was regarded for a long time as being one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world. They've both been able to solve the mystery that is TJ Dillashaw. And I understand that MMA math, in terms of looking at who people have beaten and saying, okay, well, if you've beaten this person, then I can beat that person. That's not a thing. But it makes the fight very intriguing. I know that Cejudo was supposed to fight former champion Jose Aldo, and of course that didn't end up happening, and Dominic Cruz was able to step in. But I think it says a lot about the respect the organization has for Dominic Cruz, where here's a guy who respectfully hasn't fought in such a long time, who's able to walk back in to a title fight.
Yeah.
I think that's huge. So and he's also been training during this time, and I understand training doesn't replace actually being in there in a live fight, but he knows what he's getting into. So I'm hoping Dominic Cruz wins just because I'm a huge fan of his. But again, anything can happen. I think they're both very, very good. I think I think Dominic Cruz's way of winning this is probably point fighting, whereas Cruz is probably going to look for the finish. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. You know, Triple C definitely has the power advantage and what we would call, the strength advantage for sure, and definitely with that wrestling as his base. You know, it's really interesting, your point about Dominic and being out, because I think one of the things we saw him say this week is he's been an analyst for the UFC for the last couple of years, and he's
Yeah.
really been, uh, really working on his game. And he was talking about that, about, training his mind. And I think, there's the physical piece to fighting, and then there's the mental piece. And interesting to see him so confident based on mostly staying in that mental piece. And then now with his body being off so long, actually being able to show up and compete at a high level, it's going to be very interesting. But I think you hit the nail on the head. Ultimately, Cruz has got to point his way to it and, work on his footwork and be elusive in the fight. And I think you'll see Triple C just come straight forward, trying to cut off the cage and try and either use the wrestling to take him down or use some of those big strikes that we saw versus Moraes to put him down, and then probably either submit him or hit him on the ground with strikes.
Yeah. Now, you and I, neither one of us is perfect, and sometimes we get things wrong. We have been saying in the featherweight championship, it was actually they're going for the bantamweight championship, and the title that he gave up. I'm looking over here at my iPad, so I'm not trying to distract you. Is the flyweight championship? That was it. Was the flyweight title. The name flyweight was escaping me because I was thinking 135
Gotcha.
one. So it's the bantamweight title they're going for. Before we talk about the main event, I want to ask you a question. Of course, this is taking place in an empty arena. How much do you think the empty arena, how much of that is going to be a factor in terms of the performance, or what fighters draw in terms of like the energy that fighters draw from a crowd? So for the last few months, WWE has been performing in an empty arena. Obviously, I realize it's scripted. It's kind of an apples and oranges thing. I get it, but that is a show, that is a promotion that relies heavily on audience engagement, but they're still trying to make it work. There are a lot of fighters who come in and they feed off that level of energy. Do you think that that's going to make a big difference for some of the fighters that are competing? Perhaps for wrestlers who are used to performing, with all due respect, in smaller venues, maybe not as much. So somebody like a Henry Cejudo, who is a wrestler, that might benefit him. But do you think the lack of a crowd is going to be a factor in these fights?
When I first thought about it, my answer was no. And, taking the fighters at face value, they've been asked this question many times. And a lot of them, what they'll say is, they're so in tune with the fight and listening to their coach that a lot of times they can't even hear the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
However, when you're talking about influencing a fight, and this happens a lot, is if a crowd starts to boo, for example, that can affect the referee. That can also affect the fighter, right? We've seen it many times where the crowd starts booing and you see the referee stand them up right away, and someone who had an advantage on the ground all of a sudden is standing with someone. So I think it can have a factor. I think, to the point, I don't believe we have enough tape on it yet to see what actually happens, but in theory, could it make a difference? Absolutely.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think that if there was a lot of fighters that come out and the first thing they're doing is they've got the flag, or draped over their shoulders, and they're running and they're shaking the hands and they're getting pumped. There's none of that now. So,
Right.
but again, I also think this is a very psychological event as well, and not this particular event, but it's a very psychological sport, and being
Yeah.
able to, some people might want to drown that out. So I definitely see it being a potential factor, but I certainly don't see it being a factor to the point where, oh, I lost because there was no crowd. I don't think it's a factor to the point of being a scapegoat. If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
It'll be something interesting to circle back on for sure and see if our thoughts were correct.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, main event time. We got Justin Gaethje going for the interim lightweight championship against somebody who has already had the interim lightweight championship, being Tony Ferguson. So just some history. Tony Ferguson comes into this with a 12-fight undefeated streak. He's a absolute machine. His training regiment has been well documented. He was supposed to fight Khabib again, as I mentioned, I believe it was April the 18th. He made weight on for that fight on April the 17th, which would have been weigh-in day. Why? Just because he could have, just to say hey, I was ready to do it, and he would have made weight. He's just absolutely crazy, and I mean that in the nicest of ways, because God
Mhm.
knows I don't want to run into Tony Ferguson in an alley. Is this the fight that you're most excited for?
It is absolutely the fight I'm looking forward to most. And I think I would touch on that Tony making weight point. I actually saw a guy, and I want everyone to check him out. His name was David Goggins. He's actually an endurance runner. And essentially, he was talking about Tony and mental warfare and how crazy it was that Tony went and made weight. And essentially, his claim was that Tony was doing that not just to show that he was crazy, but to show everyone else in the division that if he makes a commitment, he's going to do it. And essentially, he'll go through the pain just to make sure that he made the weight. And I think that was something that showed you a little bit into the psyche of Tony Ferguson. He's a different individual. You alluded to it. He trains like a madman up at Big Bear. The methods that he used are pretty unheard of when it comes to MMA. And I think, when you have other fighters who go and train with him, they come out ultimately super, super excited. And they talk about his footwork and the intense training and the stuff that they learned. So I took a tangent there, but ultimately, yeah, really, really looking for excited for Tony to get back in the cage.
I agree with you. The Dominic Cruz fight is actually the fight that I'm probably most excited for, but this is a very, very close number 2. Tony Ferguson again has just plowed through opponents and has just been on an absolute tear. But Justin Gaethje's no slouch either. Justin Gaethje is a knockout artist. So I'm going to ask you in a moment how you see this breaking down. But for myself, looking at this fight, again, it's one of those things. The longer this fight goes on, it does favor Tony, not just because of his ridiculous training regime, but let's keep in mind, he has been preparing to fight Khabib for months. For months, he has been training to fight, whereas Gaethje got a call, and it was like at first, when this looked like it was going to be on the 18th of April, he had maybe a few weeks. Now he's had a little longer, but it's not a full camp. It doesn't mean that he can't win the fight. And I mean, if you were to tell me, hey, Keith, I'm not going to tell you who won, but it was over in the first round, there's a good chance that it was Gaethje. But if this goes deep water, it's like 4th, 5th round, money is going to be on Tony Ferguson. One thing for sure, this is not going to be a boring fight. This is not going to be some sort of Tyron Woodley, Damian Maia, where they just run around the octagon for sure. 5 rounds. They're going to go after each other.
Absolutely.
How do you see this fight going?
Well, I see it ultimately as an interesting style matchup, but I think when you look at Gaethje's skills, he's got these excellent wrestling chops, which he rarely uses. So ultimately, I'm like, will he use the wrestling? Mm-hmm. I think the answer to that is no, because if he was going to use the wrestling, he's going to end up being on the ground with Tony Ferguson. And I think Tony Ferguson's ground game is far leaps and bounds above Gaethje's. And I think ultimately we're going to see a stand-up fight. I think Tony's going to want to keep it on the feet. I think Gaethje's going to want to keep it on the feet. I think, the footwork is very different between the two. I think what you'll see is Tony Ferguson ultimately confuse Gaethje a little bit with his dynamic footwork and hit a higher volume of strikes and put Gaethje down. But I do agree with you. If it is an early one, it's going to be, Gaethje is connected somehow. He is a knockout artist. His last couple of fights have been really good. I think he's on a 3-fight win streak. The last one was over Cowboy. And, it was really a performance where he sat him down in the middle of the cage in the first, 30 seconds of the fight. Mm-hmm. So dynamic performance. And ultimately, though, I'm going to have to go with Tony. I think he's, like you said, he's been training too long. He's so dynamic. His footwork is amazing. He can win the fight on the feet, on the ground. Other than the wrestling battle, I think he takes it everywhere. So I'm thinking Tony's going to take it.
It's an interesting thing you were saying about his wrestling, because I remember when Tony Ferguson fought Kevin Lee, and that was for the interim title as well. And Tony Ferguson won that fight, but in the first round, Kevin Lee was able to take him down. I didn't think Kevin Lee's wrestling was on the level of a Khabib's. So he was able to survive that. So I don't know if I'm sold on Tony Ferguson from a wrestling point of view. I know he's got a great ground game, but if he's against a high level wrestler, I'm not sure. Consider this though. So let's say Justin Gaethje comes in, and I don't want to necessarily say shocks the world, but it would be an upset, gets the upset. Yeah. All of this talk over the last few years of Tony and Khabib all becomes moot, because at that point, the next fight for Khabib isn't going to be Tony Ferguson, it's going to be Justin Gaethje. And the winner of that fight is clear. It's their manager, Al Aziz, because he manages them both. So do you not think that it's interesting that Tony Ferguson taking this fight has so much more to lose than Justin Gaethje does?
He does, and I think it speaks to the craziness of Tony Ferguson, right? Like he really should be out waiting for Khabib and probably has a fight in September. Yeah. So it speaks to the kahunas of this man. I think he wants to get out there and show his skills. And ultimately, I think he looks at Gaethje as someone he's going to have to fight anyways. So might as well just get it done now.
Well, it'll be interesting. I mean, let's just say, again, let's play matchmaker for a second. Justin Gaethje wins this fight. In the fall, we've got Justin Gaethje and Khabib in a co-main event. How about Tony Ferguson and your boy Conor McGregor?
I'd sign for that right now. Winner,
right?
winner meets in the next pay-per-view.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this. On the horizon, are there any other fights that are coming up that you're looking forward to seeing?
Yeah, they announced 2, right? That are coming up this week.
Yeah, so we've got the card this coming Saturday, and then we've got a card next Wednesday. So a week tomorrow, and then another one a week Saturday, and they haven't announced anything after that.
So I think it's Smith Glover Teixeira, which is not a bad fight, and then you've got Overeem versus Walt Harris in the other main event, I believe, which is next Saturday.
Yeah.
Decent fights there. Although, if I have to pick one of them, I think I'm looking forward to this weekend. It's obviously a pay-per-view type card and a much more stacked event.
Yeah. Now, my last question before I let you go: have you been paying attention to the mind games that's going on between Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic?
I've seen some of the back and forth for sure. They definitely have an interesting dynamic. I think, it's interesting that Stipe is pushing the fight so much. I know he was hurt, I believe, from one of the eye pokes that he sustained. Yeah. But, ultimately it would be nice to see those two get in there and finish that off. I think Cormier is definitely playing some games with them, but I'd love to see that fight.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And like yourself, I'm excited to see that as well. Although I saw an interview where Stipe said that he's not working on Daniel's timetable, he's working on his own. And he, unfortunately, his city, like every city, I guess, except for pretty much Jacksonville, is on lockdown. So he can't train right now. And he said he's going to fight him, but you could see that Cormier is itching for that fight. And I look forward to having you back on, and we can break down that card when that finally gets signed. To everybody checking this out, we, on behalf of James and I, we hope that everyone is safe and that your loved ones are safe and everyone is doing okay. Thank you for taking some time from your day to check this out. We love talking about the UFC, and sometimes we just throw a camera up, and we hope you guys are entertained and informed by some of the things that we have to say. So, James, thank you so much for taking the time from your day to jump on here with me and check this out. And I'm sure that we'll be texting through the night as we check out this phenomenal card of great fights that are coming up this Saturday.
Thanks for having me, Keith.
Okay, everybody take care, and we will see you again soon. Bye.